He thought he could humiliate her in front of the entire room. But he had no idea he was about to expose his own limits instead. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. Now, back to Emily Carter. The lecture hall at Princeton University shimmered under bright white lights, rows of polished wooden seats filled with graduate students, visiting scholars, and some of the most respected minds in applied mathematics. At the center of it all stood Professor Daniel Harrington, a man whose reputation carried more weight than most textbooks on the shelves behind him. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, his silver hair combed back with precision, and his voice, sharp, controlled, and absolute, cut through the room like a blade. "What we're discussing today," he said, writing a dense line of calculus across the board, "is beyond standard comprehension. It requires not just intelligence, but discipline." A few students nodded eagerly, scribbling notes as if each word was law. Others simply watched, careful not to draw attention. In a place like this, attention was rarely a good thing unless it was earned. Near the back of the room, almost invisible among the crowd, stood Emily Carter. Her gray cardigan hung loosely over a simple white blouse, her hair tied back without effort, her posture quiet but steady. Most people didn't notice her. Those who did assumed she was staff, maybe administrative, maybe someone who had wandered in by mistake. And that assumption suited her just fine. She listened without interruption, her eyes following every symbol Harrington wrote, every equation layered carefully on top of the last. There was no reaction on her face, no sign of confusion or admiration, just stillness. And then a pause. Harrington stopped mid-explanation, glancing toward the back as if something had disrupted the rhythm of his control. Emily had slightly raised her hand. It was subtle, almost hesitant, but it was enough. A few nearby students exchanged looks, confused. Someone like her didn't ask questions here. Not in this room. Harrington narrowed his eyes, the corners of his mouth tightening just enough to reveal irritation. "Yes?" he said, the word clipped impatient. Emily's voice was soft, calm. "I think there may be a small inconsistency in the transformation you used in step 4. The room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. A ripple of quiet tension passed through the audience. A student in the front row leaned back, eyebrows raised. Another stifled a laugh. Harrington didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at her, measuring. Then, slowly, a smile appeared, but it wasn't a kind one. It was the kind of smile that came right before someone decided to prove a point. "An inconsistency," he repeated, turning fully toward her now. "That's interesting." He set the chalk down for a moment, folding his arms. The silence stretched just long enough to make the air feel heavier. "Why don't you come up here?" he said finally, gesturing toward the board, his tone suddenly performative, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And show us exactly what you mean." A few quiet chuckles slipped through the room. Not loud, but enough. Enough to mark the moment. Emily didn't move right away. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady, unreadable. And somewhere beneath the polished surface of that lecture hall, something shifted, something no one there was prepared for. Emily Carter felt every pair of eyes in the room settle on her as the faint echo of Professor Harrington's invitation lingered in the air, but her expression did not change, not even slightly. As if the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders was something she had carried long before stepping into that lecture hall. A student near the aisle leaned toward his friend and whispered under his breath that this was going to be embarrassing, while another quietly pulled out a phone, already anticipating a moment worth remembering for all the wrong reasons. And at the front of the room, Harrington watched her with a composed impatience, the kind that came from years of never being questioned, never being corrected, never being wrong in any room that mattered. "Well?" he prompted, tapping the chalk lightly against the board, the faint clicking sound echoing sharper than it should have. "We are waiting." And a few scattered chuckles followed, low and controlled, but unmistakably dismissive. Emily finally moved, her steps unhurried, measured, each one landing softly against the polished floor as if she were not walking toward a test, but simply crossing a quiet room. And the contrast was unsettling to some who expected hesitation, or at least a visible trace of doubt. Instead, she carried nothing but stillness with her. As she reached the front, Harrington stepped slightly aside, gesturing toward the equation stretched across the board, a dense chain of symbols layered with intention, designed not just to challenge, but to overwhelm, and he folded his arms again, positioning himself just enough behind her to make it clear that this was his stage, his audience, his moment. "Please," he said, his tone smooth but edged, "show us the inconsistency you mentioned," and the room tightened once more, the quiet now heavier, more expectant, as if everyone sensed that something was about to unfold, though none could quite name it. Emily picked up the chalk, turning it once between her fingers, her gaze tracing the equation from beginning to end, not quickly, not slowly, but with a kind of deliberate clarity that did not match the assumptions already formed about her. A student in the front row frowned slightly, noticing the way her eyes moved, not searching, but recognizing, and somewhere behind him another voice whispered, softer this time, uncertain, "Wait, does she actually understand this?" Harrington caught the shift in tone, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing, choosing instead to let the silence stretch, convinced that it would collapse under its own pressure. Seconds passed, longer than anyone expected, and yet Emily did not rush, did not react to the tension building around her, and then, without announcement, without looking back, she placed the chalk against the board and made her first mark. It was simple, almost understated, but precise, and the sound of chalk against the surface cut cleanly through the room, drawing every eye forward as if pulled by a single thread. One line became two, then three, each step following the last with a quiet confidence that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. The earlier whispers faded, replaced by something else, something closer to disbelief, as the structure of the problem began to shift under her hand, not broken, but refined, adjusted, corrected in ways that only someone deeply familiar with its logic could attempt. Harrington's posture changed slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for those closest to see that the certainty in his stance had begun to fracture. And still, Emily said nothing, her focus unbroken, her movement steady, as if the noise of the room, the judgment, the expectation, had all ceased to exist the moment the chalk touched the board, and in that growing silence, something unmistakable began to take shape, not just an answer, but a revelation that the room was not prepared to understand yet. The chalk continued to move in Emily Carter's hand with a calm precision that no one in that room could ignore anymore. Each line, she wrote, tightening the structure of the equation, refining it, correcting it in ways that subtly but undeniably challenged the foundation Professor Harrington had presented just minutes earlier. And the shift in the atmosphere was no longer quiet curiosity, but something sharper, something heavier, as if the room itself had begun to realize it was witnessing a moment that did not fit the script they had all expected. A student in the second row slowly lowered his pen, his notes forgotten, eyes locked on the board as Emily rewrote a transformation that Harrington had declared essential, adjusting it with a cleaner, more elegant approach that removed the inconsistency she had mentioned, and a faint murmur rippled through a small cluster of visiting scholars near the aisle, their expressions tightening not with amusement now, but with recognition. Harrington stepped closer, just slightly, his gaze fixed on the symbols forming under her hand, searching, almost urgently, for a mistake, a hesitation, anything that would restore the balance of authority he had so carefully built, but there was none, only a sequence that flowed too smoothly to be accidental, too deliberate to be guessed. Emily paused for the briefest moment, not from uncertainty, but from completion, her eyes scanning the full equation as if confirming what she already knew. And then she added one final notation, a small correction that changed the outcome entirely, resolving the inconsistency with a clarity that left no room for argument. The room fell into a deeper silence, the kind that does not come from politeness but from collective disbelief. And somewhere near the front, a senior professor leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he studied the board, his lips parting slightly as if he was about to speak, but stopped himself, needing another second to be certain. Harrington's expression shifted, the confidence that once defined his posture now replaced by something far less controlled, his arms slowly uncrossing as he stepped closer to the board, reading, rereading, his mind racing to reconcile what he was seeing. with what he believed to be true, and yet every line held, every transition made sense, every step aligned with a level of mastery that could not be dismissed. That is, he began, but the words did not finish, caught somewhere between disbelief and reluctance, and behind him, a quiet voice broke through the silence, hesitant but clear. That is not just correct, that is better. And more heads turned now, more eyes shifting not to the board, but to Emily herself, studying her with a new awareness, trying to reconcile the simple woman standing there with the complexity she had just unraveled so effortlessly. Emily did not react to the growing tension, did not turn to face the room or acknowledge the weight of what she had done. She simply placed the chalk down with the same calm motion she had used to pick it up, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if the act itself required no explanation, no recognition, no validation. Harrington remained where he was, staring at the board, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface as the reality of the situation settled in. And for the first time in that room, the authority he carried seemed to falter, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that everyone could feel. Then, from the front row, a chair scraped softly against the floor as the senior professor who had been watching so closely slowly stood, his eyes fixed on Emily with a mixture of shock and realization. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that shifted the entire room. "I know that work," he said quietly. "I have seen that methodology before." And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was charged, as if the next words would change everything. The senior professor's voice lingered in the air, low but unmistakably certain, and every head in the room turned toward him as if pulled by the gravity of recognition. His eyes still locked on the board before slowly shifting to Emily Carter, studying her not as an outsider anymore, but as something entirely different, something the room had failed to see from the beginning. "That structure," he continued, taking a slow step forward. "The correction in the transformation, that is not standard theory, that is advanced framework development." And a faint tension tightened across the audience as a few visiting scholars exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence replaced by a creeping realization that this was no longer a simple demonstration gone wrong. Professor Harrington straightened slightly, attempting to regain control, his voice measured but edged with strain. "It is a variation, nothing more," he said, though his eyes betrayed the uncertainty he could not fully hide. A clever adjustment, but not entirely unfamiliar. And yet, even as he spoke, he turned back to the board again, tracing the lines Emily had written, searching for something, anything, that would support his claim. The senior professor did not respond immediately, instead stepping closer to the front, his gaze sharpening as he examined the final notation Emily had added. And then, almost imperceptibly, his expression changed, not into confusion, but into recognition so clear that it silenced even the quietest whispers in the room. "No," he said at last, his voice firmer now, carrying across the hall with authority that did not need to raise itself. "This is not a variation." And the pause that followed stretched just long enough to let the weight of his words settle. "This is original work." And the room reacted not with noise but with stillness, a collective intake of breath held in suspension. A student near the center leaned forward, eyes wide, while another slowly shook his head as if trying to reject what he was beginning to understand, and Harrington's posture shifted again, his composure tightening into something rigid, something defensive. "Original," he repeated, the word clipped. "From whom?" And the question hung there, not just directed at the professor, but at the entire room. The answer came quietly, but it carried further than any raised voice could have. "From her," the senior professor said, his gaze never leaving Emily. "I attended a closed seminar 8 years ago, a research-intensive session on nonlinear systems, invitation only." He paused, letting the memory align with what stood before him. The lead instructor presented this exact framework, refined, precise, ahead of its time. And now the room was no longer silent out of uncertainty, but out of shock, as pieces began to fall into place. A murmur started, then faded, as if no one trusted their own voice enough to break what was happening. And Harrington's face lost what little color it had left, his eyes moving slowly from the board to Emily, then back again, as if reality itself had begun to slip beyond his control. Emily remained still, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her expression unchanged, neither confirming nor denying, simply allowing the truth to emerge on its own. That seminar. Another voice added from the front, quieter but urgent. It was led by Dr. Carter. Emily Carter. And the name settled over the room like a final piece of a puzzle no one had realized they were solving. A chair creaked softly somewhere in the back, but no one turned, no one moved, as every ounce of attention fixed itself on the woman they had overlooked just minutes before. And in that moment, the imbalance of power that once defined the room did not collapse with noise or confrontation. It simply disappeared, leaving behind a silence so complete that it spoke louder than anything else ever could. The name echoed through the lecture hall with a weight that no one could ignore, and for a moment it felt as though the air itself had shifted, pressing down on every person in the room as they processed what had just been revealed. Dr. Emily Carter, the same woman they had quietly dismissed, the same woman who had been mistaken for staff, now stood at the front of the room as the origin of the very framework they had been studying. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain or curious. It was absolute. Professor Harrington did not move at first, his gaze fixed on the board as if the equations might somehow rearrange themselves into something more familiar, something less threatening to the authority he had built over years of unquestioned dominance. But they did not change, and neither did the reality settling around him. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned toward Emily, his expression caught between disbelief and something deeper, something closer to realization. Though he struggled to give it a name, Dr. Carter, he said at last, the title sounding unfamiliar on his tongue, as if it had arrived too late to carry the respect it deserved. If that is indeed the case, then perhaps you would like to elaborate on your correction. And though his words attempted to reclaim structure, to restore order to a moment slipping beyond his control, the subtle shift in his tone did not go unnoticed. Not by the students, not by the visiting scholars, and certainly not by the senior professor who had spoken first. Emily met his gaze calmly, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and for a brief second it seemed as though she might decline, might simply walk away and leave the room to sit with what it had already learned. But instead, she turned back to the board. Without a word, she lifted the chalk again, not to prove anything, not to argue, but to clarify, and as she began to write, her movements carried the same quiet precision as before, each line connecting seamlessly to the next, not rushed, not hesitant, but deliberate in a way that reflected not just understanding, but mastery. The room leaned in without realizing it, drawn by something they could not quite articulate, as Emily expanded on the correction, demonstrating how the original transformation introduced a cascading inconsistency under certain conditions, and how her refinement not only resolved it, but simplified the entire framework, making it more stable, more efficient, more complete. A student in the second row slowly lowered his notebook, no longer attempting to write, simply watching, absorbing, while another shook his head softly, whispering to himself as if trying to keep up with the realization forming in his mind. Harrington stood just to the side now, no longer at the center, his presence diminished not by force but by contrast, as the clarity of Emily's explanation illuminated the limitations in his own approach. He opened his mouth once, as if to interject, but stopped, the words dissolving before they could form, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to challenge, only something to understand. When Emily finished, she stepped back slightly, placing the chalk down once more with the same quiet finality, and for a second, no one spoke, no one moved, as if the room needed time to adjust to what it had just witnessed. Then, slowly, a single pair of hands came together in a soft, hesitant clap from the front row, followed by another, and then another, until the sound built into something fuller, not loud or overwhelming, but genuine, earned, and impossible to ignore. Harrington did not join them, his hands remaining at his sides, his eyes fixed not on Emily now, but on the board, on the correction that had quietly redefined everything he thought he controlled. And in that moment, without a single word of accusation or confrontation, the balance of respect in that room had shifted completely, leaving behind a truth that no one there would forget. The applause lingered in the room longer than anyone expected, not because it was loud, but because it was real, and when it finally began to fade, it left behind a silence that felt different from before, no longer tense or uncertain, but reflective, as if every person in that lecture hall was quietly recalibrating their understanding of what they had just witnessed. Emily Carter did not acknowledge the applause. She did not bow her head or offer a smile. She simply stood there for a moment, composed, her eyes drifting once more across the board as if confirming that everything was complete, and then she stepped back, creating space not just physically, but symbolically, returning the room to itself. Professor Harrington cleared his throat softly, the sound almost lost in the stillness, but enough to draw attention back to him. And, for the first time since the session began, he seemed unsure of how to proceed, his usual precision replaced by a careful deliberation, as though every word now required consideration. "That was an insightful clarification," he said, his voice measured, though the subtle strain beneath it did not go unnoticed. "And I appreciate the contribution." But even as he spoke, the shift in authority remained undeniable. The center of gravity in the room no longer anchored to him as it had been before. A student near the front raised his hand slowly, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Professor, is that method going to be included in the final model?" And the question, simple as it was, carried an implication that could not be ignored, because it did not look to Harrington for confirmation. It looked past him, toward Emily. Harrington paused, his eyes flickering briefly in her direction, then back to the student. And in that hesitation, the answer was already clear. "It may require further review," he replied, choosing his words carefully, but the confidence that once defined his responses had softened into something more cautious, more aware. Another voice followed, this time from one of the visiting scholars. "Dr. Carter, have you published this refinement?" And the shift was complete now. The questions no longer directed at Harrington, but at the woman who had quietly redefined the discussion. Emily turned slightly, meeting the scholar's gaze, her expression calm. "Was part of a private research series," she said simply, her tone steady. "Not all work needs to be published to be useful." And the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, not dismissive, not defensive, but grounded in a confidence that did not seek validation. A faint murmur of agreement moved through a few of the older professors, those who understood the value of knowledge that existed beyond recognition, beyond titles and formal acknowledgement. Harrington stepped back another half step, almost unconsciously, creating more space between himself and the board, as if the equations themselves no longer belonged to him. And in that subtle movement, the last trace of his earlier dominance dissolved. The senior professor who had first spoken nodded slowly, a small gesture of respect. "Your work shaped more minds than you realize," he said. And this time, there was no hesitation in the room, no doubt, only acknowledgement. Emily inclined her head slightly, not in acceptance of praise, but in recognition of the moment. And then, without drawing attention, without waiting for further questions, she stepped away from the front of the room. Her footsteps were as quiet as when she had first approached, but now every sound carried meaning, every movement observed, understood in a way it had not been before. As she reached the aisle, a few students shifted instinctively, making space, not out of obligation, but out of respect, their earlier assumptions replaced by something far more enduring. Harrington remained at the front, his gaze lingering on the board, on the correction that had quietly altered the foundation of his lecture. And though he said nothing more, the silence around him spoke clearly enough, because in that room, on that day, authority had not been taken, it had been revealed, and it no longer belonged to the one who had tried to display it. The door at the back of the lecture hall closed softly behind Emily Carter, but the sound seemed to echo far longer than it should have, as if the room itself was not ready to let that moment end. And for several seconds no one spoke, no one shifted, as though the presence she had carried with such quiet certainty still lingered in the space she left behind. A student near the aisle finally exhaled, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and turned to his friend with a look that needed no words. While across the room, a visiting scholar adjusted his glasses, still staring at the board as if the equations might reveal something new with each passing second. Professor Harrington remained where he stood, his posture upright, but no longer commanding. His gaze fixed on the correction that had so effortlessly dismantled the certainty he had presented. And though he had spent years mastering the art of control, of guiding rooms exactly where he wanted them to go, this moment had slipped beyond his reach in a way he could not ignore. "We will take a brief pause," he said at last, his voice steady but quieter than before, and it was the first time anyone in that room had heard hesitation in it. Chairs shifted softly as people began to stand, but the usual low hum of conversation did not immediately return, replaced instead by a subdued murmur, conversations that stayed close, cautious, as if everyone was still trying to understand what had just happened. "Did you see how she rewrote the transformation?" One student whispered, his voice edged with disbelief, while another nodded slowly. "That was not just solving it, that was redefining it." And a third added, almost under his breath, "And we thought she did not belong here." The words carrying a quiet weight that hung heavier than any earlier laughter. Near the front, the senior professor who had recognized her remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting on his cane as he looked at the board, then finally rose with a measured movement, turning to Harrington with an expression that was not accusatory, but knowing. "Talent rarely announces itself," he said softly, just loud enough to be heard. "It reveals itself when challenged." And though the words were simple, they carried a truth that settled deeply into the room. Harrington nodded once, a small, controlled motion, but there was no quick response, no attempt to deflect or redirect, because there was nothing left to reshape, only something to accept. As the students began to file out into the hallway, their conversations grew slightly louder, but the tone had changed, no longer dismissive or casual, but reflective, almost reverent, as if they had witnessed something rare, something that would be spoken about long after this day. A young woman paused near the doorway, glancing back at the board one last time, her expression thoughtful, and then she quietly said to no one in particular, "I want to learn like that," before stepping out into the corridor. Inside the hall, the lights remained bright, the equations still visible, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely, no longer defined by hierarchy or expectation, but by the quiet recognition that knowledge does not always stand where you expect it to. And as Harrington finally stepped closer to the board again, studying the correction not as a flaw, but as something to understand, the silence returned once more, not empty, but full of meaning, because in that moment, the lesson had already been taught, and it had nothing to do with calculus. The hallway outside the lecture hall filled with a low, steady murmur as students and scholars moved in clusters, their conversations no longer casual but charged with a quiet intensity, each voice trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed, and yet none of them fully able to capture it. Emily Carter walked through it all without drawing attention, her steps unhurried, her presence still understated despite the shift that had followed her out of the room. And though people glanced at her now, some with recognition, others with curiosity, she did not slow down, did not engage, as if the moment behind her had already been set aside. A group of graduate students stood near the glass doors, one of them speaking in a hushed tone. "I read about her work once. I just never thought I would see her here." While another shook his head, "She did not just solve that equation, she changed it." And the realization settled among them not with excitement, but with a kind of respect that felt heavier, more lasting. Inside the lecture hall, the air remained still, the bright lights casting sharp reflections across the board where Emily's correction still stood, untouched. And Professor Harrington had not moved far, his attention fixed on the same lines, but now, with a different focus, no longer searching for error, but trying to understand the depth of what had been placed in front of him. The senior professor stepped closer once more, standing beside him in quiet observation, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying more weight than any exchange could have. "You built your reputation on certainty," the older man said at last, his voice calm, not accusatory, but reflective. "But certainty can become a blindfold." And Harrington did not respond immediately, his gaze still on the board, his expression composed but distant, as if the words had landed somewhere deeper than he was ready to admit. After a few seconds, he exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that signaled something shifting beneath the surface, and then he reached for the chalk again, not to erase, not to correct, but to continue where Emily had left off, carefully tracing the logic she had introduced, testing it, following it step by step. And for the first time that day, his movements were not driven by performance, but by genuine inquiry. In the hallway, Emily paused briefly near a window, the late afternoon light casting a soft reflection across the glass. And for a moment she simply stood there, looking out over the campus, students crossing between buildings, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside one room among many. And then she adjusted her sleeve slightly, a small, almost habitual motion, before continuing on her way, back inside. A few remaining students lingered near the doorway, watching as Harrington worked through the revised framework, their expressions no longer skeptical, but attentive, as if they were witnessing a different kind of lesson now, one that did not rely on authority, but on humility. "He is learning," one of them whispered quietly, and the other nodded. "Yeah, finally." And though the words were soft, they carried a truth that echoed through the nearly empty room. Harrington stepped back after a moment, looking at the completed sequence, now fully integrated with Emily's correction, and for a brief second, he allowed himself to acknowledge it, not with pride, but with acceptance. And as he placed the chalk down once more, the room fell into a final, steady silence, not of tension, but of understanding, because what had happened there could not be undone, and more importantly, it did not need to be. The campus had begun to settle into the quiet rhythm of late afternoon as the golden light stretched across the pathways, and somewhere beyond the tall stone buildings, the distant sound of students laughing blended into the calm. But inside one lecture hall, something far more lasting had already taken root. Professor Harrington remained alone now, standing in front of the board where the corrected framework still held its place. No longer a challenge, no longer a disruption, but a truth he could not ignore. And as he looked at it one final time, there was no frustration left, no resistance, only a quiet understanding that what he had witnessed was not a moment of embarrassment, but a moment of revelation. He reached up slowly and erased a small section of his original work, leaving Emily's correction untouched, as if acknowledging that some things were not meant to be replaced, only learned from. Outside, Emily Carter continued walking across the campus, her pace steady, her presence blending once again into the everyday movement of people who had no idea what had just unfolded behind those walls. And that was exactly how she preferred it, because recognition had never been her goal, and validation had never been her need. A group of students passed her, still deep in conversation, one of them saying, "I am going to look up everything she has ever written," while another added, "I think we just saw what real mastery looks like." And Emily heard them, but did not turn, did not react, because the moment had already served its purpose. Back in the lecture hall, the senior professor lingered at the doorway for a moment before leaving, casting one last glance toward Harrington, not with judgment, but with a quiet respect for the shift that had taken place, because transformation, when it happens honestly, is never loud. It is measured in the moments where pride steps aside and understanding takes its place. Harrington finally turned away from the board, his posture different now, not diminished, but grounded, as if something had been reset within him. And as he walked out of the room, the echo of his footsteps carried none of the certainty he once relied on, but something far more valuable, something earned, across the campus. Emily paused briefly at the edge of a courtyard, watching as the sunlight reflected off the windows of the buildings around her, and for a moment, there was nothing to prove, nothing to correct, only a quiet sense of balance restored in a world that too often rushed to judge what it did not understand. And then she continued forward, disappearing into the flow of people, leaving behind no announcement, no explanation, only the memory of a moment that would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. And in that silence, in that shift, the truth remained clear, not spoken, but felt by all who were there, that knowledge does not demand attention, and true mastery does not seek approval. It simply reveals itself when the moment calls for it. And in that room, on that day, dignity had spoken without raising its voice, leaving behind a lesson that no equation could ever fully capture. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, do not forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.